Well, hello and welcome to The Point. My name is David Flavel, I'm the Minister here, and it's great to welcome you to our online Zoom meeting today. We'll be looking at the book of Galatians, a book written by one of the earliest followers of Jesus, a man called Paul, and we're continuing our series as we look at freedom. You're very welcome, especially if you're not yet a Christian. Our church is designed for you. Today what we're going to do is I'm going to talk for a little while about what Galatians says, then we're going to have a short time of discussion, then we're going to come back together again. So I hope you find what we're about to talk about interesting, and I hope it gives you the opportunity to have your say. Let's see what Paul has to say in Galatians chapter 4. Paul has been talking about the law. Some people have come from Jerusalem and come to the people of Galatia and told them that they have to follow the law. They have to follow the rules if they want to be proper Christians, which is not what Paul told them when he met them. So now he goes on with his argument. Tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and the other by the free woman. His son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh, but his son by the free woman was born as a result of a divine promise. And this is from the book of Genesis, and Abraham did indeed have two sons. What happened was God came to Abraham and promised him that he would have a son with his wife Sarah, even though they were very old. Well, Abraham was astonished by this, as was his wife Sarah. They didn't really believe it. So Abraham, as was common in those days, went to his slave girl and said to her, okay, my wife won't give me any children, so you're going to have to. So she had children because Abraham had doubted God's promise. And so he had one son called Ishmael by the slave woman Hagar. And then the other woman was Sarah, and the son Isaac was the child of the promise. So there were two sons, actually more, but there were two main sons. One who was as a result of Abraham's unbelief and unwillingness to trust God, and one was the gift of God by free grace. These things are being taken figuratively. Now, what do we mean what does Paul mean when he says these things are being taken figuratively? To take something figuratively, or to take something allegorically, is to look at something and then see the sort of type of thing it represents. And the early Christians did this a lot with the Old Testament. They looked back at the Old Testament and they saw what it had to say, and they said, oh yes, that actually relates to Jesus, because if you look at the way it says these things, there's something more that can be seen, a deeper meaning. And Paul is trying to find the deeper meaning in the Old Testament story from Genesis, the story of Hagar and Sarah, the story of Ishmael and Isaac, to produce his argument. He wants to say, look at the way the Old Testament was written, and you can see in there something of what I'm trying to say. Now, to our eyes and our ears, this can seem very difficult, and what we're going to talk about today is very thorny, but there is something that we can get from it. Spurgeon famously said, when he ate fish, he didn't eat everything bones and all. What he would do is he would take the bones out and eat the fish. And that's what we're going to do today with the Bible reading. The tricky bits, the thorny bits, we're going to set on one side, but the meat, the fish, we're going to see what we can come up with. Because it is difficult, this idea, this figurative idea, and what Paul has to say is difficult in our ears today. These things are being taken figuratively. The women represent two covenants, two agreements if you like. One covenant is from Mount Sinai and bears children who are to be slaves. This is Hagar. Now Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. So one covenant is the agreement that was made on Mount Sinai, the agreement of the law, and that corresponds to the city of Jerusalem in Paul's time, which he claimed was under the law of Moses, and in effect in slavery. Because remember, Paul is trying to make the contrast between the Christians and the Jews in slavery to the law and the Christians with freedom. But the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is our mother. So as Christians, we are citizens not of the Jerusalem which is below, the one that's under the law, but the Jerusalem that is above, the new Jerusalem, the one that is coming. And we belong to her. We are her children. allegory is a tricky concept, and yet it's still in the use in the world today, from Harry Potter's Dementors, the idea of depression and taking the joy out of everything and sucking it away, to C.S. Lewis's Narnia, going back to Pilgrim's Progress, to Dante's Inferno, even back to Jesus and the story of the prodigal son, which is, some circles can be seen as an allegory of Judaism and Christianity, or you can also see it as an allegory for people who've been in church for years and people who've only just joined. But the allegory that Paul uses here is tricky in another way because of its subject matter. For it is written in the book of Isaiah, in the Old Testament, "Be glad, barren woman, you who never bore a child. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are never in labour, because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who has a husband." And this is a classic upside down, turning over passage from the Old Testament, where those who are at the moment at the bottom of society will be at the top, and those at the top will be at the bottom, and those who have no children, those who long for children, those who desire children, will be able to have them. But then Paul goes on. Now you, brothers and sisters, like Isaac, are the children of promise. At that time the son born according to the flesh persecuted the son born by the power of the Spirit. It is the same now. And Paul's drawing the link between the way that Isaac was had difficulty with his older brother Ishmael, who was always stronger and more powerful and mocked him, with the way that the Christians, as a tiny minority, were being persecuted by the Jews. And Paul used to be part of that persecution. But then he goes on further. But what does Scripture say? Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we are not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman. And this sounds so harsh to our ears. First of all, assuming that slavery is normal, but secondly, getting rid of the slave woman and her son, banishing them into the desert to die, for they will not share in the Father's inheritance. So what do we think of that? We like to think of the Bible as saying things like Jesus loves everybody, and that everybody's accepted and all are received, which is true. But here we have Paul talking about people being expelled, people being thrown out, people being in slavery. How on earth do we manage to fit that together with the idea of a God of love? Which brings me to my question. Now, normally we have 3 questions, but now we're in a world of Zoom. We're going to have just one question. And today's one question is, what do we do when the Bible is thorny? And I've deliberately chosen the word thorny because it gives the idea that when we put our hands on it, it hurts, it's sharp, it's difficult. And in today's passage, we read of slavery, we read of people being expelled, we read of one woman being rejected, another woman being accepted. There's all kinds of things in there which are difficult. Now, you might say, well, we pretend it's not there, or we just ignore it, or we run away from it. But I think we can do more than that. So that's your question for today. If you're watching live on Zoom, then I'm going to try and put you into breakout groups where you can discuss it, and then we'll come back together. If you're watching this on the catch-up on video, then just put the video on pause and have a think about this for yourself. And we'll come back to you in a little bit. Well, that's it for this week. We're still learning how to use Zoom. So if you are watching this live, then do feedback to me anything that will be helpful or anything that you'd like to look at. Otherwise, we'll see you soon. And I'll ask the person in charge to say the final prayer after I give you my takeaways for this week. So what must we do? Well, number 1, don't pretend that the Bible isn't sometimes thorny. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's difficult for us to understand. Sometimes it's hard for us to draw out what was culturally appropriate then and what makes sense now. But number 2, don't give up if you find something that's hard to understand or clashes culturally. Just because something is difficult doesn't mean to say that it's not worth wrestling with. Just because something doesn't fit our modern society doesn't mean to say it doesn't have something to critique our modern society or talk to our modern society about. So when it gets tough, don't give up, keep on going.